Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Johnson speaking. I am the points of contact for performance measurement tool issues for your program. Today, the Enhanced Collaborative Model Task Force to Combat Human Trafficking. Thank you so much for joining and getting the knowledge that will help you with your reporting. So today, I want to get you acquainted with the basics of performance measures, provide an overview of the questions you will answer in PMT, and address some common reporting challenges. While today we will focus on more the substance of your program's performance measures, there will be a separate training in early December covering how to navigate and use the PMT online platform, everything from logging credentials to generating reports. You should be getting an email about that announcing the dates and times for it soon. At the end of this training, you should be able to walk away with a better understanding of your reporting requirements and why BJA requires reporting for PMT, as well as some common challenges that we'll go through. This section of the training will provide an overview of performance measures and the reporting process. Let me start off by clarifying that today's training is for reporting requirements placed on the BJA-funded law enforcement grantee in your task force. We know that we all have, if you're a BJA law enforcement grantee, we all have victim service provider partners who are receiving funding from the Office of Victims of Crime, or OVC. They have their own separate reporting requirements for entry data into what's called the Trafficking Information Management System, or TIMS. So this only covers what BJA grantees have to report into the performance measurement tool. There should be separate resources for TIMS that your OVC partner reports into. So, what exactly is the Performance Measurement Tool, or PMT for short? The Performance Measurement Tool is the online data collection tool for Office of Justice Program grant recipients. It is structured as an online questionnaire made up mostly of short answer questions, which grantees submit once a quarter throughout the life of their grant. Now keep in mind, the Performance Measurement Tool, or PMT, is a separate system from the Grant Management System, or GMS, which are used to manage and report on many other aspects of your grant. Twice a year, we require you to generate a report out of the PMT system that you will then upload into the GMS system. This allows the information you report into PMT to be accessible to all the grant program managers that you work with at BJA. At the bottom of the slide here is a link to the PMT website, which you can explore once your login credentials are created. This slide outlines the PMT reporting schedule. The important quarterly deadlines are highlighted in the lower left-hand corner: January 30th, April 30th, July 30th, and October 30th. The year is divided into 4 periods of activity, and during the month after the end of that reporting period, the system will be open for you to submit your PMT data. After you submit your data, your answers will be locked, and you will need to then contact the PMT help desk to unlock your data and edit reports if you need to. However, the PMT is accessible year-round to review data. The second to left column here shows the type of data that you'll be reporting each reporting period. For every reporting period, you'll report on short answer performance measures, which require, just multiple choice or numerical type of answers. But for the reporting periods twice a year that are due January 30th and July 30th, as well as whenever you end your grant, we also ask you a few key open-ended narrative questions related to your goals and objectives and your progress towards them. Also, for these periods, January and July, that we report on in January and July, you'll need to generate that report out of the PMT data out of the PMT of your data and upload it into GMS. Now, twice a year, the BJA-funded law enforcement entity and the OVC-funded victim service provider are each going to upload the listed attachments here into the grants management system. So these reports, what we call part of the joint semi-annual progress reporting, provide a comprehensive picture of what the DOJ-funded task force has accomplished over the reporting period. I'm not going to go over these in full detail, but please refer to the accompanying tips for completing semi-annual human trafficking enhanced collaborative model and progress report guide that we'll make available for you to download at the end of this presentation. Essentially, in brief, the files that you'll be uploading into GMS semi-annually will include the performance measurement tool data that's generated out of the PMT system, some select trafficking information management system data reports, which are from the system that the OVC partner typically reports into. And then thirdly, there's a joint narrative report, which is just a Word document providing a brief analysis of any variances or significant differences in trends apparent from the PMT data and the TIMS data reported by law enforcement and victim service providers about their cases, their number of victims encountered, etc. Many of the differences that you might see in data reported in between these two systems are quite reasonable, and this gives you a chance to explain some of the differences in reported activities between the OVC and the BJA grantee. Moving on, here is a link to the Performance Measures Questionnaire. This is a PDF document which lists every question that you will encounter in the online PMT system to report on. You'll find that it's easier to track your required data to report outside the PMT on an ongoing basis, and then add it all together when it is time to report in the PMT. We strongly encourage you to use whatever approach is more effective for you. You'll see a screenshot of the cover page to the questionnaire here on the slide. This page is a handy reference with reporting deadline and contact information if you need it and have any questions. A large part of today's webinar is focused on getting you acquainted with the actual questions in the PMT that you'll answer. But before diving into that, in a nutshell, I just want to provide you an overview about how PMT reporting helps us understand how you are using BJA funding to obtain inputs and conduct your activities, which in the end turn into the outputs and outcomes that you want out of your grant program. So when we go through the PMT questions, you'll see that there's going to be quite a few that ask about your program's inputs, such as staff, training and technical assistance, etc. And likewise, you're going to see some questions about activities conducted around data collection and evaluation, trainings, task force development, development of policies, procedures, and protocols. Now, activities are the actions that convert those inputs, like staff and training, into outputs that eventually result in measurable progress towards the program's goals. Now, these kinds of things can include such items like investigations and prosecutions and staff that you've trained and empowered through the resources you've given them. Ultimately, outcomes speak to longer-term or more bottom-line program goals, such as the number of victims you've identified, the perpetrators you've charged or convicted, etc. Data collected in the PMT is used to help BJA understand the successes and areas for improvement of your individual task force, but also the trafficking program as a whole. The data collected help us respond to congressional queries, the media. They help us to secure and plan future funds for grantees such as yourself, and they provide transparency and accountability that's required by U.S. law. We hope that you as grantees will also use performance measures to identify areas of improvement and communicate your own progress towards goals. And the PMT even provides within the open-ended narrative questions portion an opportunity for you to document needs for training and technical assistance and communicate to us about those. However, you should always feel free to reach out directly to your TTA provider and program managers and policy advisors. They strive to be responsive to your requests for help and training and technical assistance. So with that opening, this is a quick review to check on what you've learned so far. Please take a minute to respond to these questions on the right side of your screen. All right, well, thanks for answering our short little question. I think everybody pretty much got these right. How many days after the close of a reporting period is your PMT report due? 30. How do performance measures help grantees? All of the above. So thank you. Now let's go into the type of questions you will encounter in the performance measurement tool. We'll give you a little taste about the format of the questions, but then also the substance of the questions. As mentioned in the earlier part of the training, the questions in the PMT are made up of two main category types. The first is short answer program performance measures. The second type are qualitative narrative questions, open-ended questions about your progress towards goals and objectives. And these, again, are answered during the January and July reporting windows. The performance measure data that we collect that are more short answer or numeric in nature are used to track performance against program goals and create a nationwide picture with what we hope are quantifiable data for BJA. But the narrative questions really give you a chance to express in your own words how your experience has been conducting program activities. And both categories are equally important. So on the left side, here is a review of the short answer question types. Numeric, multiple choice, multiple response, short open text. We also try to reduce reporting burden by having a couple of different type of questions that you see laid out on the right. Carry forward questions are questions that need to be answered only once and updated if needed. For instance, they might ask you about who your points of contact are for partners, etc. Skip flow questions are sprinkled throughout your questions within PMT, and they help us determine if you really do need to answer questions, if they're applicable to you, or if you can just go ahead and skip them. This here on the screen is an outline of the sections you will see laid out in the questionnaire, which you will be able to download at the end of this presentation. We will go through a very high-level overview of these in the next slides. I won't be able to go through every question in this webinar, unfortunately, so please take time to review the questionnaire when you have a chance to download it. The first questions you'll encounter when you open up the PMT system or look at the questionnaire help to determine how much the rest of the questions in the whole set of PMT questions you actually have to answer. So, if you answered yes to the first question, is this your last reporting period? Then the PMT system will actually activate a set of 2 closeout questions for you to answer at the very end. And if you answer yes to the second question, was there grant activity during the period? Then you proceed to answer the rest of the questions within the PMT. Now, you might answer no. For instance, if you're waiting on your budget to be approved or you haven't hired the grant program manager who will actually coordinate all of the grant's tasks, you will be able to answer no, and then the only questions you will have to go on to answer are number 3, which asks for a list of current task force partners, and if you're reporting in a January or July reporting window, a few open-ended semi-annual narrative questions about your goals and objectives. If you did conduct grant activities using BJA funds, you will go on to answer a full set of PMT questions. These start out with sections that cover some basic information describing your agency, project, and personnel. Most of these, you only have to answer once and update as needed. The next few sections start gathering information about activities you conduct, your task force meetings, your development of policies, procedures, and protocols to address key areas, data collected and shared by the task force, and activities undertaken with your program's evaluator. The next sections start to cover some of the actual results and outputs of your grant activities. The Law Enforcement Investigation and Prosecution section is a key section, asking you to report numbers related to conducted investigations, identified victims, and prosecuted suspects. We will be highlighting some commonly asked questions around this section a little later in this presentation. But for now, I want to emphasize that for this section, the Law Enforcement Investigation and Prosecution section, along with the ones related to community outreach and training listed here, only report on activities of law enforcement task force partners. These include the primary BJA-funded grantee that is receiving your grants, as well as any other federal, state, or local law enforcement partners. For instance, when it comes to community outreach activities, we'll be asking you about those kinds of activities that you've provided to the community. If someone on your task force is from a federal law enforcement agency like HSI or FBI, and they've conducted a community outreach event, report on that even if that person's salary is not funded by the BJA grant. However, you will not need to report on community outreach activities undertaken by your victim service partners on your task force. Towards the end of your questionnaire, there is an organizational integration question, which essentially is a simple, quick question asking how well your task force activities are integrated into the wider organizations or agencies of its members through disseminating knowledge, through trainings, etc. And during the last reporting period only, grantees are asked to report on 2 additional closeout questions that focus on how they plan to sustain task force operations and use results from their project evaluations. Semi-annually, grantees have to answer 7 open-ended narrative questions, which will go into more depth later on in the presentation. So now that I've gone through a whirlwind tour overview of different sections, this next portion of our webinar is going to highlight some common reporting challenges that we see. And the areas that we're going to focus on the most are the law enforcement investigation and prosecution section, as well as those open-ended narrative questions. And again, I'll be providing an overview of these issues, but I won't necessarily have time to go into every single question in these sections in full detail. So please, when you have these webinar slides sent to you and as a resource, please review them later on when you're looking at your questionnaire so that you know exactly what you need to report on. To introduce this section, we'd like to share how BJA identifies common challenges. BJA has a team called a Planning, Performance, and Impact Team that essentially works with your performance measurement data to assess data consistency and accuracy. And we reach out to grantees whenever we identify potential issues. Program grant managers also conduct site visits where they identify documentation and verify PMT data entries. At the end of the day, we're here to help, and we're also interested in making sure that you know exactly what to report. Now, let's take a closer look at that law enforcement investigation and prosecution section. I've basically put here an overview of the type of data points that we'll be collecting through this section. In essence, these questions in this section ask for counts related to new and ongoing human trafficking investigations and the potential victims identified through those investigations, suspected human trafficking perpetrators that have been arrested, criminally charged, and convicted, and finally, confirmed victims broken down by several geographic traits such as age, gender, and nationality status. Now, for each of these items that we'll be asking you to provide counts for, we'd like you to provide a breakdown of those counts as they relate to cases where only sex trafficking is present, cases where only labor trafficking is present, and then cases where both sex and labor trafficking are present. So let's go through some frequently asked questions about this particular section. So one is, what is included in those categories for sex only, labor only, and both sex and labor trafficking? The main thing I want to highlight here is the both sex and labor category refers to cases that include both sex and labor trafficking. Those investigations that know they are focusing on both those issues. So don't add together the values under the separate categories for sex only and labor only trafficking and put them in this both sex and labor category. In other words, these categories that you see, sex only, labor only, both sex and labor trafficking categories, they shouldn't overlap, and they're mutually exclusive. And of course, just a word about sex trafficking. Individuals under 18 that are engaged in commercial sex or survival sex should be counted as victims of sex trafficking, even if there's not force, fraud, or coercion involved. Now, question 23 and 24 are going to ask about the counts of potential victims. And then a little later on, we have a question 26 that's going to ask you for counts of confirmed victims. So what's the difference between these? While potential victims are identified during the course of an investigation, we won't ask you to count them as confirmed victims until they meet one of the criteria listed here. So please refer to this handy checklist when you actually get to recording and reporting these victims. Now, for the victims that you're going to report on within question 23, 24, and 26, another question we often get is, well, do I include victims that receive services from task force victim service providers, but maybe they're not attached to any particular law enforcement investigation that we have going on? And the answer here is no. Since your grant is focusing on law enforcement efforts, when we ask you to report on counts of victims you've encountered, focus on those that you've encountered through your law enforcement investigation efforts. And you'll see how OVC partners, the victim service provider partners, when they do their reporting, they may provide, in response to questions about their victim counts, a slightly different number because of just the nature of where they're encountering those individuals. Now, when it comes to question 25, question 25 asks about suspected human trafficking perpetrators. And as part of it, we ask about the number of individuals arrested for human trafficking related incidents. Now keep in mind, this question asks for the number of individuals, not the number of arrests. So, if an individual gets arrested more than once, potentially, you only have to count that individual once. And it does not include those arrested for prostitution, because we're focusing rather on those suspected of trafficking others. Another part of question 25 is going to ask you when it comes to those individuals suspected for human trafficking, provide the number of those who are criminally charged. And it will ask you this by saying, give me the counts of the number of people criminally charged for any offense, and it'll ask you for the number of individuals that are criminally charged for a human trafficking related offense. So keep in mind that any offense is a broader category. Prosecutors may use a much broader set of charges to go after suspected human trafficking perpetrators because that's part of their strategy, and we want to include counts for those when you answer about individuals charged criminally for any offense. But when it comes to reporting the counts for individuals that are charged with human trafficking related offense, please specifically limit that to those that are charged under human trafficking statutes. And this slide, which you can refer to later as a resource, will just help define what these terms really mean. Question 25 is also going to ask you about the number of individuals convicted, i.e. found guilty, pled guilty, or accepted a plea agreement for human trafficking charges. So when we answer this question, please understand that this is only limited to those convicted on charges specifically under human trafficking laws. Now, when it comes time to reporting against question 25, we'll also ask you to report whether these individuals that have been arrested, criminally charged, or convicted relate to federal or state and local investigations. This slide clarifies that in a few instances, they could actually fall under both categories due to the joint nature of an investigation. Task forces may be coordinating in such a nature that you could count that particular individual as being part of both a federal and a state and local investigation, and therefore they would effectively be counted under both columns in the reporting that you provide to us. Question 26 goes on to ask about the numbers of confirmed victims. And as part of that, we ask you to break down those counts by their nationality status. PMT uses some definitions that differ slightly from common usage, so please pay attention to the guidance here. I won't go through this in total detail because there's a lot that will just be easier for you to refer to as you're actually compiling your reporting, but in essence, the PMT asks you to break down your counts into U.S. citizens and foreign nationals. And at the end of the day, what we really mean under that U.S. citizen category is people who have a legal status to reside in the U.S. and will not need continued presence or a T or U visa to remain. And foreign nationals are people who do not have a legal status to permanently reside in the U.S. And also, if you ever don't know the case, you don't have to provide numbers within the categories provided. You just don't have to report on those. Okay. And I just want to reiterate here that for the law enforcement, investigation, and prosecution section, as well as the community outreach and training sections, you should report on activities of any law enforcement task force partners. So if you are a local police department that received their grant from BJA, and one of your task force partners is the FBI, and you know that they conducted a human trafficking investigation in your area, even if you, the direct BJA grantee, were not directly involved in that investigation, you still need to count that investigation in your PMT reporting. Ideally, there's quite a lot of collaboration going on, and you would be in the know through some kind of involvement, but we understand that sometimes there might be a lot of various and sundry things going on. We want to capture all the law enforcement activities. The other main section we want to provide additional guidance on here today are the narrative questions related to your goals and objectives. As you can see from the screenshot on the left side of the screen, here you will be asked to identify goals for your grant and your progress towards those. What is your current status towards achieving this goal? Describe any progress that you've made, any barriers you've encountered, and what are your plans to keep on achieving this goal in the next few months. The grant managers really rely on this section to get a fuller picture of your unique task force efforts. So articulating good goals is key, and it is recommended that you use the time task plans submitted with your grant application as a starting point to craft meaningful goals that align with those set out in your grant program application and solicitation. Well-defined goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. They help clarify priorities and establish criteria for success. However, they need not be set in stone and can be reevaluated, and they can help you collect data to make course corrections as needed. So we're actually almost done with overviewing the questions for the PMT. And now that we've come to this point, it's time for a last review. Please answer the final two polling questions to the right side of your screen before we move on to a question and answer portion of this training. All right, thanks for responding to our poll. So it looks like, again, most people got the right answer, which is not a component of a SMART goal. Assorted is not a component of a SMART goal. How does BJA verify performance data? All the above is actually correct. Quarterly data verifications, once you report your data, we actually go through and try to see if there's anything that looks out of bounds. And we'll respond to you if we need you to look at something a little closer and correct it, potentially. There are going to be ways that the PMT will be able to say, you know, this looks like it's an out-of-bound number because it doesn't line up logically with another field, and you may not be able to go further unless you do give an answer that is within bounds, and also site visits. So all of the above. So the one thing that I want to leave you here with today is that BJA PMT has a help desk, and that you can always reach out to them during office hours, Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, except federal holidays. We strive to return everybody's email and phone call within 24 hours, so please don't hesitate to leave a voicemail, email, even after business hours. We'll leave the webinar open for about 5 to 10 minutes so you can download any handouts attached or use the Q&A box if you have any questions. And a recording of today's training and other user materials and resources are going to be posted online. And I'll also make sure to try to get an email out to people who received this training about these resources as well. My name is Jennifer. You can expect to see an email with my contact information soon. On behalf of BJA and the PMT team, thank you for your time, dedication, and hard work. And this concludes the presentation before we go on to our Q&A session.